There's a long stretch of South Figueroa Street in Los Angeles that, to the untrained eye, looks completely unremarkable. It's the kind of place you drive through without really noticing, lined with fast food joints, old motels, broken sidewalks, boarded-up storefronts, liquor stores, and car washes with faded signs. But for people who've lived in the neighborhoods it runs through, South Figueroa is anything but forgettable. It carries a heavy, unspoken history. For decades, women, almost always black, almost always poor, vanished from this area. It wasn't just a case here or there. It became a pattern, a deadly one, and year after year, no one seemed to want to talk about it. The street didn't just become a backdrop for tragedy, it became a symbol of what happens when certain lives are treated like they don't matter. These disappearances didn't come out of nowhere. They weren't accidents. They were the result of something deeper, decades of systemic neglect, racial bias, and the way society has always looked the other way when poor black women go missing. Many of the women who vanished were involved in sex work, often as a last resort to survive. Some struggled with addiction. Some had no stable housing. All of them were people, but because of their circumstances, they were dismissed. When their families reported them missing, they were met with indifference. Police officers would shrug, say, maybe she left town, or check the hospitals. There were no helicopters in the air, no news trucks, no candlelight vigils broadcast live on TV. Their stories never made it into the papers unless a body was found. And even then, the articles were short, buried, and full of implication. The killings started stacking up in the 1980s, but the city didn't seem to take notice. Or maybe it just didn't care. Women were turning up dead in alleyways, dumpsters, and vacant lots, strangled or shot. Yet the cases stayed cold. The community was terrified. Families whispered about a serial killer, even if the authorities didn't want to say the words. And in the middle of it all, one man kept slipping through the cracks: Lonnie Franklin Jr. He lived right there in the neighborhood, just blocks from where some of the women disappeared. He wasn't hiding. He went to backyard barbecues. He talked to neighbors. He worked for the city. And for more than 20 years, he quietly hunted and killed, blending into the background of a community that was already being ignored. When Franklin was finally caught in July of 2010, the arrest came after years of silence and missed chances. It wasn't a random tip or a confession. It was the result of quiet, methodical, undercover police work. After years of unsolved cases, LAPD detectives formed a cold case task force. They believed DNA from multiple crime scenes belonged to the same man, but they didn't know who he was. So they watched and waited. When Franklin attended a birthday party at a pizzeria in Buena Park, an undercover officer posed as a busboy, collecting utensils, napkins, and a half-eaten slice of pizza that Franklin left behind. The DNA on those items matched samples from the victims. That was the moment they knew. Franklin wasn't just a suspect. He was the killer they'd been chasing for decades. He was arrested at his home without incident, but the damage had already been done. Franklin's crimes exposed a much deeper issue than just one man's evil. They revealed how little effort had been put into solving the disappearances in the first place. The LAPD had known since the mid-1980s that women were being killed in South LA under eerily similar circumstances. There were patterns in the murders, matching ballistics, shared victim profiles. They had everything they needed to at least suspect a serial killer. But instead of warning the public or allocating resources to protect the women most at risk, the department kept quiet. Officially, they said they didn't want to create panic. Unofficially, the message was loud and clear. These victims didn't matter enough to cause a stir. It wasn't until 2008 that they publicly acknowledged the possibility of a serial killer. And even then, it took 2 more years to arrest him. And South Figueroa wasn't the only street where this happened. All across South Los Angeles, in places like Western, Avalon, Vermont, and Manchester, the same stories played out. Women went missing, families were ignored, cases went cold, the killers walked free. But something about South Figueroa stuck in the collective memory. Maybe it was because of how many bodies were found nearby. Maybe it was the visibility. The street cuts through the heart of the city, and yet it remained invisible to those in power. Or maybe it's because the people who lived there started speaking out. Community organizers, mothers, and activists refused to let the silence continue. They named names, they marched, They demanded answers, and when Franklin was finally brought to justice, it wasn't just a victory for law enforcement, it was the result of decades of community pressure. But even after Franklin's arrest, the disappearances didn't stop. In the years that followed, multiple women were reported missing within a few miles of the same stretch. Some were found alive, others weren't found at all. Community groups like the Black Coalition Fighting Back Serial Murders warned that the same conditions that allowed Franklin to operate still existed. Police were still slow to respond, media coverage was still lacking, and vulnerable women were still being targeted. The Grim Sleeper wasn't a one-time horror story. It was a symptom of a much larger disease, one where entire neighborhoods are treated like collateral damage and where justice only comes after the bodies pile up too high to ignore. The tragedy of South Figueroa is not that it became a hunting ground, it's that it was allowed to become one, that it took over 20 years and a mountain of victims before the system took meaningful action, that families had to fight for every scrap of attention, every press conference, every investigation, that women had to live with the knowledge that if they disappeared, no one might come looking, and that even now, after all the headlines and documentaries and court cases, the basic conditions haven't changed. Poverty, addiction, housing insecurity, racial bias, these aren't footnotes, they're the foundation, and until those things are addressed, the cycle will continue. South Figueroa stands today with a new coat of paint in some places. New developments are moving in. Rent is rising. City planners call it progress. But for those who remember what happened here, the street is haunted, not by ghosts, but by memories. Memories of missing daughters, of phone calls that went unanswered, of evidence that sat in storage, of the slow, grinding pain of being ignored. The people who live here don't need another mural. They need justice. They need protection. They need to know that next time, someone will care before it's too late. And in the end, we can't talk about the Grim Sleeper without also holding a mirror, because South Figueroa wasn't cursed by geography. It was cursed by indifference.